the tropes behind $1 Million Story. Look, books, when they succeed, and when we all start buying them, or whether it's a movie or a television show, there's usually a reason why. And oftentimes those reasons go back to the tropes in the story. Tropes are like cognitive shortcuts. They allow us to understand something about a story and what it's going to give us just through the trope, right? Like it gives us this understanding that is hard to do without it. Tropes are a really interesting concept. And something that before this podcast, I felt like I knew, but after this podcast, I feel like I'm ready to apply this superpower in a whole new way to not only my writing, but also my marketing. And that's because today we have on Jennifer Hilt, who is the author of the Trope Thesaurus, and honestly, like, just is an incredible person, knows so much about not only tropes, but writing and this business of publishing. And such an honor to have her on to talk about not only how tropes apply to books, but also how tropes apply to movies and film. Because for those who don't know, I've been building Creatorwood, which is a platform that helps anyone turn their book into a movie or television show in less than a day using AI. And what I want to understand is, how does the same storytelling tropes that we know in writing apply to this new world of film now that writers are really able to go and break into this new world? So that's what we're going to talk about. I'm super excited for the podcast. And in the links in the description, you can find one, how you can join Creatorwood and actually turn your book into a movie or television show today. And two, the link to Jennifer Hilt's books and all for other awesome stuff, because she just has so much amazing resources out there for writers. With that said, let's dive into this episode. Jennifer, I am so excited to have you on. You're actually our first official guest here on Movies Podcast.
Whoa.
Yeah, first ever, which I don't know if that's a trope, like first guest. I don't think that's a trope, but
No, but I guess it'll prepare me for when, I don't know, who's the new one now? Not Kelly and her husband or something like that. So this will prepare me for some big thing like that, right?
yeah, you will be ready. It's so interesting because I want to hear about your story and have the audience learn like how you came around to writing the Trope Thesaurus and developing, I think, probably like the best body of knowledge on tropes out there. But first, I feel like there's a fundamental question we need to answer, which is, what is like the basic definition of a trope? Because we throw that word around a lot, but I'm not sure all of us know what it actually means.
Great question. That was the thing that I spent a lot of time figuring out myself. The first and foremost thing about tropes is that it's an easily identifiable concept. So when we talk about bride, love triangle, revenge, really most of the 40 tropes that I think are like the main meaty one, it's something that anybody with a 6th grade reading level or above can identify, and they know what it is, and it's not some fancy term that they feel lost or they have to look up. It's been interesting to see that my 9-year-old nephews instinctively use tropes when they make up stories. And so I think it's just part of our human connections, but it's just really, so that's like the first important thing I think people to know. It's just it's a general concept that's like easily identifiable and relatable to humans. There's a couple other things that I've come to understand with tropes. And one is that I feel that they don't have a judgment. It's just an idea. So when we say something like loner, it could be either somebody who's a quote unquote good loner or a bad loner. It's just like this idea of a person who's isolated and is going to go on a search for community. And then really the other thing that I think is important is that tropes are about relationships. And that's what I think that instinctiveness that people are drawn to them with is that, oh, we all want stories about relationships, but tropes give us like a vehicle to do it. So those are like the things that I think about with tropes, and that I hope people can, if you come away with anything with this from me, it's, oh, okay, it's like something that I already know that's out there, but maybe I haven't thought about using it in these ways.
Love it. Thinking of tropes as relationships is really interesting. And I know that you have the framework GMC, right? That you really hammer home, which I love, about like how to actually use tropes productively. Because I think I see this especially in romance. It's fun where it's, okay, you have the book cover and then you've got the 10 tropes that are in that book all highlighted around it. And readers will freak out, oh my God, this has enemies to lovers, whatever I'm looking for, which is great. But it's like, it's one thing to just have trope soup.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But it's another thing to actually cook it in a way that makes sense. And
absolutely.
I think GMC helps with that. So I would love for you to share like what that is.
Sure. GMC stands for Goal, Motivation, Conflict. And there's a book written by, I'm just starting to blank on her name, even though I talk about her book all the time. But anyway, goal, motivation, and conflict. I know you guys will put it in the show notes. And she wrote a book. So she wrote a book about that probably 30 years ago. And I've been doing this a long time. And I read that book, but I couldn't really think of a way to help it with my writing until I started to work with tropes. And then I was like, oh, this is how you can use goal, motivation, and conflict. It's a simple concept, but it takes time in your story. Like when I talk about it right now, I feel like people think, oh, I'm going to just sit down and dash off goal, motivation, and conflict. And when you write a really good story, you're going to write it, write goal, motivation, and conflict, then you're going to revise it, then you're going to revise it, then you're going to revise it. And that's how you get this really tight goal, motivation, and conflict. So a goal is obviously a thing that the character in the story needs. Sometimes they're aware of it, sometimes they're not. But I like it. I feel like the stories, when we look out in story world, the one's a goal that is tangible. So that's why we see tons of things about, oh, somebody inherited a bed and breakfast that they have to fix up before it's foreclosed, or somebody's trying to win an election, or somebody's trying to stop a wedding. It's really important, I think, to have a concrete goal in that way. When people want to write a story and they're like, oh, I just want them to be in love. It's like really hard to plot a story that shows that and delivers conflict. That can be like your kind of ephemeral idea, but you want to show, and using a goal, how you're actually going to get there. And then motivation is really the why, the character's why. And those and also the theme of the story. And those also take a while to come to. I don't necessarily start off with my story thinking of that. And then conflict is really the juice, your like total secret sauce of this. And to write the best stories, when you look at them, you'll see that the goal and the conflict are in opposition for each other. Basically, somebody wants to catch a killer, but yet the killer is going to turn out to be like their best friend. Or there's something that causes this great conflict. And that's why I think that tropes and goal, motivation, and conflict like work so well together, because it gives you a way to develop each of them.
Well, do you mind telling us just a little bit about your background as well, just for our listeners?
Yeah. I did an undergraduate degree in linguistics a zillion years ago. And I just am like, even as a kid, though, growing up, I grew up in the 70s where you were like allowed to wander all over. So I could go spend all this time in the library reading whatever I wanted. And so those two things informed me through life's course of always being curious, like how a story was put together. Even as a kid, I was wondering, I literally remember thinking, how come Little Women and Little House on the Prairie each have 4 sisters with one that's going to die or that's sick? And then I remember thinking about that, but I didn't really get how to really think about it. I just noticed those things. So it took me so I think I've just instinctively liked this kind of like symbolism and kind of story structure. So I wound up doing things with linguistics with that. But it was neat that it was during the pandemic that I had time to really, as I was teaching students, to realize, oh, I don't really understand what a trope is. And I was trying to use it and teach. We were talking about building characters, and people would say, I want to write a story with this and this. And I was like, oh, okay, so you're talking about a best friend's forbidden love story. And they'd be like, oh, but I wanted to write a good story, and those are tropes. And this was like during the pandemic where we were not quite as excited about tropes as we are now. And so it made me, like, as a linguist, go, yeah, but why? But yet, why did we need this as a common language? So then I just went through and read like all kinds of cool stuff, from like literary fiction to genre fiction, movies and things, really looking and seeing, oh, they're everywhere. It's just a matter of how you develop them. So that's been exciting and fun for me to do.
Follow-up question related to that. So in literature, you categorize tropes into person, place, object, secrets. How does this translate into visual filmmaking?
I think it was interesting. So I was thinking about that because I watched some of these drama box things you guys were talking about.
Yeah.
And one thing that I thought was really interesting with those was, there's a couple things, but all that is like what happens next. And tropes are really, I feel like it doesn't matter what kind of story you're telling. That's like what it boils down to, whether it's visual or on a page or auditory or whatever. And I thought, oh, that's what they're doing in these. And they are heavily, obviously, using tropes to do them. I think that's like the important thing to think about. The degree of development is something that's up for debate or grabs for how people want to do that. But I guess basically I would start with that. And then I feel like you're just trying to show as much as possible with, I guess I was just trying to think of really secrets, I thought, are the way that we see that the most with the visual storytelling, because it's like we see the characters meet and they're like, a lot of these are like mistaken identities or hidden identities. And so then we peel back a layer and oh, they're this. And then we peel back another layer. So I feel like there's a lot of secret use of tropes with those.
especially when you're jumping back and forth between like multiple character
Yeah.
perspectives. Like you've got, like I was thinking of one where it's like you have the tension of knowing the main character is hooked up with this hockey player, but then at her job, they're saying, hey, if you can't get an interview with this hockey player, you're going to get fired. And it didn't
Right.
exactly end well with that
Right.
initial interaction. So there's that sort of tension. And it's, yeah, I want to keep watching just because that secret, which is huge because I know you boil down tropes until they're going to create conflict and with either through like secrets and change, which is very interesting. But you said something because I didn't study, I'm not a linguist, like you are the expert in this, but I'm fascinated with words as well. I think we all are. And I'm also fascinated with intersubjective realities. Like when we begin to understand that something is true, like what is enemies to lovers? We all now have agreed this is a thing. And this is like a very foundational, kind of weird question, but it's something I nerd out about. And I know you've thought about it, which is when does something become a trope? Like, how do we know? Because it's not like these tropes, they feel like so primordial, like they've existed since the beginning of time. But a lot of these feel like they've come into popular understanding maybe more recently, or some maybe have been around forever, quote unquote. But yeah, what begins to start to cross something from just being an idea to now being a trope, at least in pop culture?
I think honestly, it's more, I think all these tropes can really be traced back to fairy tales. And you could probably even go
Hmm.
back farther than that. But I really feel like I almost feel like every romance is some form of Beauty and the Beast, right? He's like your original grumpy hero and all this. So that's just my little thing about that. But then I feel like Beauty and the Beast turned into Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre, and then we see it again and again in various things. So I think that the tropes are just there, but I feel like we talk about them differently now. And I think it's because honestly, social media for sure, but I also think it's because of Hollywood has been much more upfront about tropes for years than ever like writers have. Like I like every Julia Roberts movie almost has a trope in the title. Or I think of things of the Step Brothers movie or 40-Year-Old Virgin. I feel like Hollywood really did a very good job of understanding. I talk about in the book this one quote that the give me the same thing, only different. That's like totally true. And when I figured out that the thing was tropes, it made a lot more sense to me when I looked at stories. So anyway, it was just something in if Save the Cat, which everybody should read by Blake
That
Snyder.
book.
Yeah, there's that quote in there, which I just loved for years and was always like, what's the thing? What's the thing that this producer told him? Give me the same thing, only different. And that was when I was like, with the tropes, it was the light bulb. But yeah, something like 40-Year-Old Virgin fascinates me because I think it's a great example of tropes because for one hand, okay, and I think it was a while back, but like the virgin trope, how in our culture could we do anything interesting or different with the virgin trope, right? But yet the goal, motivation, and conflict with both the characters with that. And then it's really about relationships. It's not just about the sexual act. So that to me was like, oh, it's really showing that tropes have been around for a long time. But I think Hollywood has been really great about using them more. And for writers, we're just indie writers or filmmakers or whatever, indie filmmakers, you're like catching up to it now. And then that whole TikTok thing with where you put your tropes and all in the books have just made audiences more savvy about them. But I don't think they're really new. I just think we're like talking about them more upfront.
Okay, yeah, and it sounds like you're emphasizing twisting tropes to avoid cliches. How might a filmmaker twist like classic visual trope, like maybe the monster in the house in a horror movie, for example?
I think the important thing to know about twisting tropes is like everybody wants to twist them, but the important thing to know is you need to understand what the trope does before you twist it. Because I think we can be in a hurry to, oh, I want to twist it. I want to twist it. What's the next new way to twist it? But understand what the issue is before you start playing with it. So I feel like at the bottom of supporting all the tropes is really the question of power. But I always think, oh, it's going to sound like a women's studies lecture or something like that. But you think about it in relationships, there's usually some kind of power imbalance anyway in all our relationships. And so to twist a trope, you need to understand, okay, what is that relationship? Like, what is it straight up? So if you're like a monster, I guess a good example of trope twisting would be the woman in peril trope, which is like this idea of the final girl. She's the thing that's being hunted. And like a great straight up example of it would be something like Silence of the Lambs, right? Where women are being hunted and then this female is out to be part of the justice committee to find the killer. But now there's this whole genre of what I personally enjoy is like domestic horror, where you have the woman as the monster. And a great example of this that I've talked about is a book called Sundial by Catriona Ward. And in it, you're like, oh, you're not expecting the mother to be you're understanding a mother as there nurturing, supporting everything, and then to find out, oh, she's actually not a great person. Or the idea of Gone Girl was like, I think a really great trope twisting, because we're just like, oh, this poor woman dealing with her philandering husband, blah, blah, blah. And in the end, you're just like, oh, total gut punch. So those, you have to understand like what the power structure is to be able to twist it with tropes is, I think, the important thing about that. And I think a lot of interesting things happening now are with the formerly vulnerable characters like women or children. There was a murder, Hereditary, I think, was a horror movie that was out a while ago that I think one of the things that was interesting about that had involved a child. And people were not expecting that to be evil in colloquial terms. So,
Wow. Okay. That is amazing. Power and analyzing that, it's so cool. I think, I mean, that's very important. The power dynamics in a story too is what creates conflict. I mean, you're conflicting over something, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to get someone to want something. If there was no power imbalance, then you could get any desire you have theoretically, right? If the character was God, then God would get everything they want. So I think that's it's very foundational. It's an incredible way of looking at it. It leads me to start to think, okay, when we're looking at stories, whether we're looking at a film, which you speak of many films in the Trope Thesaurus book, which I loved hearing like your own personal anecdotes of watching this and what it made you feel, because it hammered home the points more. And also, of course, reading. How do we train ourselves to not just be consumers of film, consumers of story, which of course that's super fun,
Yeah.
but then also start to notice these tropes, these power imbalances, so that we can learn what's working for someone else? How do we like be good, I guess, trope noticers, trope citers?
Honestly, I think of it as a form of critical thinking, but I feel like in some ways people think like critical thinking is just like ripping things apart. And I almost feel a good story you can think of as like critical appreciation. And so I personally enjoy doing it, but I think it's a muscle like anything else that anybody can learn to use. I think there's a couple ways you can take a story that I think it's always easier to not look at your own work, first of all, because it's just like really personal. So I would take like a book or movie and just like when you watch it, think about what are the tropes in this? How are they working? If you're like brand new to tropes, something pretty straight up like a Hallmark movie is a great way to do it, or like a Christmas holiday, any of those, because they're very like in there. Also, just something, I think it also helps sometimes to look at a different genre than the one you work in. Say, for example, like the Fast and the Furious series, which I always laugh about when saw the first trailer for that years and years ago. And I turned to my husband, I was like, who is ever going to want to watch that? Oh my God, I would have made so much money if I had been able to invest in that. But you want to look for found family? That's all the Fast and the Furious. That's what it is. I, at the time, thought, who wants to watch a stupid movie about cars? But it is about cars, apparently. But it's really about, as he says, it's all about family. So this is, if you watch that movie, you're just going to find tons of, or something like that, tons of tropes in it. So you just get used to looking at it, and then you'll start finding them everywhere, and everything is how it works. I think it helps. Something like The Witcher has tons of, like, pretty much every trope in it, but I think done a really great way. So if you're wondering about tropes, you could check out something like that. So it's just more like starting to look at things, and then your brain will start to think, oh yeah, they used it that way, but what if I like that, but I would do it a different way? And then I think it's a good exercise for us as creative people to have that experience.
Yeah, and it reminds me a lot of the takeoff of like when like tropes become genres, because you have obviously the harem trope, and then reverse harem becomes not just a trope, but like an entire subgenre of romance defined around it. And there was something about that subversion that, especially initially, because I remember witnessing like the explosion of reverse harem, like maybe around, I think 6 years ago is when it started to really, 7 years ago, maybe now. And now it's like a huge kind of category of fiction. And it's interesting too, because you mentioned Drama Box, and I know in our notes, and we've been encouraging people to look at these short drama apps for two strategic reasons. One's because with where AI filmmaking's at right now, producing shorter episodes, a lot of these episodes are like 1 to 3 minutes long, is just like way more achievable. And then also it's just an incredibly fast growing market that is really big. But a lot of these titles, like I have it pulled up right now, and these titles always amaze me. Like, Spoiled by 4 Billionaires. Like you immediately know what that's about. Genre, but also like most importantly trope. Like we're going to get the billionaire trope. The bad boy who ruined me. Okay, I think I know what we're getting there. So they just nail this marketing really well. And I'm curious, like we've all seen the classic, again, as I mentioned, the graphic and the tropes around it. You've been talking about how like Hollywood's been nailing like tropes in their title and doing really well. Because again, 40-Year-Old Virgin, we get as storytellers thinking about like our primary tropes. How do we highlight our primary tropes in our marketing? And also secondary tropes, like should we be highlighting those as well? Or one thing I was thinking about is if we highlight a secondary trope too much in our marketing, do we risk upsetting our readers if they're coming and expecting it? I'm curious for your take on that.
Yeah. I've come to really feel like there's 4 tropes that are pretty much in every story. Found family, we already talked about that. Forced proximity. So we have to have a way that the characters interact. Oh, they're in the office together. Oh, they're in a school. I think that ticking time bomb, which I think is so important. We haven't got to talk about that, but having some time element. And the last one I think of is Ugly Duckling. And I think of Ugly Duckling as basically like character transformation. So our character at the beginning is not the same at the end. And if we want to talk about Hollywood, one thing I thought was really interesting is basically the Barbie movie to me was one big Ugly Duckling story. But it's like ironic, right? Because she's Barbie, so she's like gorgeous, but it's really a Pinocchio story, right? Because she wants to be a real girl. So anyway, those are like the 4 that when I read a blurb, if you can put those in a blurb with your tone and your voice and your storytelling elements, then it signals to the reader, oh, I want to read this because characters happening, there's urgency, they want something. So those are really like the 4 tropes that it doesn't matter what genre you're in that you see again and again, but used in different ways. So I wouldn't worry so much about like secondary tropes because I feel like those are like the great little, I'm thinking of many things, but basically those are like the great little like secondary sassy characters we like or things that make us go, oh, I wasn't expecting that. So I think it's more like trying to make sure you have enough conflict and enough character development that people are like interested in it. So that would be like my take on that.
Right. To subvert expectations. Okay. How about this? Highlighting specific tropes, maybe in a trailer. How do we do that? Is that even recommended? Are there any tropes that are unique to cinema that don't translate into prose? Yeah, no, it makes me wonder, like, how do writers learn more about tropes and genre from filmmakers?
Because we see Hollywood do them all the time. I think you're trying to, again, go to what the source of the conflict is and what the imbalance is. So I started to watch something in this drama box that you were talking about. I don't remember which the title is. But basically, they started out with a girl gets on the elevator and her skirt is unraveling. And the hero comes in and gives her his jacket and then gives it to, he shows up later. It was Asian market, I think, maybe Korean. And it was like in a school and all these kind of things. But I was just like, oh, in that like first few minutes of it, there's so much visual conflict, right? So she's in the elevator. He steps in and brings her the rest of her skirt that's caught on something and unraveling. He gives her his skirt. They're in an elevator. He actually somehow in the process swipes her badge so he knows who she is to give it later. He acts all mysterious. Somehow she doesn't know he's like this big famous guy. So they enter you're getting all that. And I don't know, maybe that was like a 2-hour thing or something, but I watched the beginning of it and I was like, oh, okay, they're accomplishing a lot in a really short period of time. So I think one thing is like, there's not a lot of talking just to talk. We see a lot of, if you're doing visual storytelling, things are happening. You guys probably know Donald Moss. He's a New York agent who's written some really great books about storytelling. And I love his Write the Breakout Novel workbook. And it's just because it really gives you actionable things to work on with your manuscript for like how to make things tighter and clearer. But one thing he says in there is you don't have characters drinking tea and talking about drinking tea. And it's, oh yeah, it's exactly the opposite of what is popular now. Like things are happening and there's a lot of action in the stories we have now. They're not characters like sitting around. Even something like Bridgerton, it's like, there's a lot of action in those stories generally, because it's not like a BEC thing. So I guess I would say to focus on those 4 tropes that I talked about, and then just try to keep focusing on the conflict of secrets and unveiling the thing you don't know and what's going to happen next. So the girl gets out of the elevator with his jacket and she tries to give it back to him and he's, oh, I'll get it later. So already I know, right? And you've seen him swipe the thing. More is going to happen. So I think it's just, and viewers are very savvy to that. And so they're just like leaning forward for okay, they're going to meet up again. And how is it going to be?
Oh yeah. The viewers are so smart. I always like to say the sort of saying we had at Beast was that like the viewer is like always smarter than you. So you just have to like that and play with that in a sense. It brings me to this interesting thing that I've been going through my mind listening, which is when we are pantsing a novel, there's a sort of easier way to go back and make changes compared to film. You even in the AI land of film, you have to go back and regenerate, and there's an expense to that, of course, because compute for everyone listening is not free. It's not nearly as expensive as filming. Oh my God, it's 1,000x cheaper to oftentimes 10,000x cheaper, but it'll add up. A lot of folks who are listening are going to be taking their stories and then bringing them to film, stories that they've already written. And it's going to usually start with the writing. But regardless of that, you're writing this story. And this story that's going to have, this set of 4 foundational tropes in it with forced proximity and all. And so do you recommend going into thinking, because even if you're pantsing, there's still a level of thought that goes into it. Okay, I have an inkling. Do you recommend going into it and being like, okay, here's what I think the 4 foundational tropes are that I'm using, and like they'll somehow make it through the story? Or do you think like more structure than that's helpful? Or is going through with less and just being like, you know what? I instinctively know tropes as a storyteller. I'm glad I listened to this and know what I'm doing, but I'm not actually going to consciously think about it. Like, I'm not sure there's one right way to go about this, but I'm trying to think about now applying this, right? Like, how do we take this and then supercharge our stories with it?
I don't think there is one way. I think what the thing about tropes that can be helpful is if you're stuck. So I think if you're an experienced author or you're just somebody who has a good level of self-confidence and you're like, I can pants my way through this story. I know it's all going to come together in the end, then do that because it works for you. But I think most of us at some point run into a wall about something. And that's when I think tropes can be helpful, because then you're like, okay, what's really the conflict here? What does this character want? Where do they come from? How is it hard for them to get it? And those are ways I think that tropes can be helpful to think about with who those characters are, because I think using tropes to inform characters in a very well-rounded way will give you lots of conflict. But I never want people to feel like, oh, there's one way you have to do it, because you could use tropes to brainstorm. You could use tropes to revise. You can use tropes at the very end to go back and edit. I think a lot of storytellers obviously just use them instinctively. And so they'll be like, I'll people say, I only have 2 tropes in my story. And I was like, tell me your story. And then of course they have a ton of tropes in there, but it's just, they're not used to thinking about them. And so I'm like, okay, that's fine. Then just pull them out when you want to do the marketing, but you don't have to, as long as they're generating enough conflict, you don't have to do something different about that now. So I can't give you like a hard and fast rule, but I think the thing is just to like, when you're stuck, to try to figure out another way to keep going. And I feel like they can be helpful with that.
You know what's super interesting is what we found is that sometimes if you don't know the trope in your story, and this isn't for everyone, but if you're comfortable using AI tools, and Creatorwood does this literally, we ingest a story and then run it through like a set of programs and prompts where we take out the key places, characters and their transformations and objects, and we are bringing those out. And I think that can be helpful if you write something and you're like, I'm completely lost. I know half the time when I finish writing a book, especially if it's a book that like I wrote like any length of time ago and I'm already writing the next one, I've low-key forgotten a little bit of what's happened in it. It's like I have to read through this to get my vibe in. What are the scenes that could be pulled out in marketing? What am I trying to emphasize here? Where could the problem be? These sorts of tools can be actually really helpful in helping bring that out. They're not 100% all the time, but they're really good. And in Creatorwood, we do that for you. And I think that whatever tool you use, that can be like interesting to have a part of your process. I don't know what tropes I'm using. It's actually, there's an intuitive sense of what these things are. So if you go and ask someone else, and it could be a human being too, it doesn't have to be AI. You can ask a reader, a viewer, to be like, hey, what is sticking out to you here that can be another way to get going.
Absolutely. I think that's, yeah. So don't get hung up. I don't know what my tropes are, or I need to, before I write the story, I need to identify these. I just think it's good at the end of the story to be able to sit back and think of, I've got these 4 things going on, right? Just to check, to make sure, that kind of thing. One thing I was going to suggest that's interesting is like, there's some really good, like the Gone Girl, the book, super different than Gone Girl, the movie. And the writer did the screenplay. So you could read that book and watch that movie and see the choices she made, because that's an interesting way that she did that. The other thing is there's a couple other interesting Slow Horses on Apple TV is like a fantastic spy series, McCarran. And it's really interesting because that's a series of where I love the books as much as the show. And I feel like they're very interchangeable. And I'm always thinking about, oh, wow, like how he did that. Because usually there's a gap between the show and the books. So it's kind of interesting. There's just like interesting things you can self-study to look at how people have done those kind of things. I just read the first Longmire book. And after I watched the series, and those are totally different. Like they clearly took the feelings of the books and put them in a very different TV show. So I think there's like really interesting questions and fun things that can be done with the adaptations that you guys are talking about. I'm trying to think about that. I really don't think so. I think we haven't talked about genre, and I think that's like kind of the other super important part of tropes is knowing what your genre expectations are. So I think, for example, enemies to lovers, everybody wants to talk about that with romance, and everybody wants to put it in their thing. And I always tell people, for the love of God, make sure you actually have an enemies to lovers if you're saying, I have an enemies to lovers in my story. Don't just put it in there because everybody has one, and then people get all upset. But that trope of enemies to lovers, we're seeing a lot in mystery, but as lovers to enemies. So the two start out, and then all of a sudden in the end, oh, he or she's a serial killer. We see that a lot. Or like the detective sleeping with the suspect and she turns out to be the killer or something like that. So I feel like it's really important to know what your genre is to work with the tropes. And we hadn't talked about that. But I don't keeping in mind, as long as you're keeping with the genre conventions, I think you can do a lot of different things with the tropes. So I can't really say that there's a trope that I don't think really works. It all just depends on like the genre.
Yeah, there's gonna be like a sort of, it's gonna show up differently visually than it will in prose, but yeah, a lot of it translates. Now, on the genre question, because genre is like something like tropes, right, that can get muddied. What is your view of A, what a genre is, and B, like it can feel like they're infinite genres, but in the Trope Thesaurus, I think you do a really good job breaking down like here's like the core overall main genres and their expectations. So what is a genre and what are the main genres that most stories fall under?
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think that's really super important. Basically, a genre is reader expectations. So when you pick up a romance, you know that somehow or another you're going to get a happily ever after for now. Nobody's going to die of cancer and she's not going to run off with his best friend. So you can write that. People say you want to write a story where, somebody runs off with somebody. You can do that, but for the love of God, don't call it a romance. That would be a fiction story. So obviously romance is the romance genre, happily ever after for now. I think these are just my main things. Mystery, I think of as justice served. Thriller, have the character survived or not? So high stakes. Women's fiction is like, what is her journey, identity? Sci-fi fantasy are really blends of the other genres, but like very heavy emphasis on, to me, world building. And horror, I think of as who is the monster. So those are like, I think this super broad, right? And a lot of really good stories they're not just one element, they're not just one genre. Like my favorite ones will have elements of mystery and romance and thriller, and if it's sci-fi or fantasy. So I don't want to be too broad about it, but you also want to make sure that you're answering those questions in those genres. And so that's why I think those genres are super important. You see those in these visual things of, okay, the romance ones are pretty, it's going to work out okay. You're just not sure how it's going to work out. That's the kind of journey that the viewers want to go on.
Yeah, no, 100%. You see it like the few times when a storyteller brands something as romance that doesn't end in an HEA or HEA for now. It's like an uprising, and rightfully so, because it's like you get off the roller coaster but fall off halfway through. It's like, whoa, that was not what we asked for.
Right.
And you talk about mashups, and you just brought it here. And I think it's interesting because you came to a similar thesis point that, I don't know if you've read the book Anatomy of Genres by John Truby. It's a good book. I think you'd enjoy it. It gets to this like interesting thesis in the end, which is he wrote it like shortly after a lot of these like AI writing tools came live, and I totally empathize with this because I have these same questions myself. There's a sort of like existential, what does it mean to be a writer in this day and age when you could just ask, hey Chad or hey Claude, like here's my tropes, here's my thing, pump out a story. And what he posits is that the place for humans in storytelling is all about like these unique mashups. And he talks about Star Wars, he talks about all these other things. What are examples of a great mashup, whether it's in film or literature, that you're like, oh, they did this great?
Oh yeah, I got a great one for you. Steph Green, she writes Stephanie Holmes, and she's this awesome New Zealand romance author. She loved cozy mysteries. but she also likes spicy, she calls Why Choose Romance. So this, we think
Yeah.
of as,
Yeah.
yeah, reverse harem. And she had the genius idea of what if I put those two together? And she is like killing it.
Oh,
Yeah. So she's got,
wow.
so she's, yeah, I mean,
Cozy mystery, because that normally doesn't get oh,
right,
so
right.
interesting.
And it's
Yeah.
been so popular. She's a very successful indie author, and now she's got a trad deal, and so I think she's a great example of two things that you would think, whoa, you can't put those together. And there are actually a lot of people who want to read that. So so check out Stephanie Holmes. Like I said, I really enjoy this domestic horror lately, which I think is like a cross of like women. Like one of the examples of that I was thinking of is the movie Night Bitch that came out. It was based on a book and turned into a movie with Amy Adams. But that's, again, it's like the kind of women's fiction story that you're not expecting. Oh, that takes a horror turn? That's like totally different. I think that's a really great mashup. But but on the other hand, that goes back to Shirley Jackson. She's an American short story author in the mid 20th century, and she was writing like great scare your pants off stuff at the time and now, but we're able to see things visually too. But I don't know that these things are really like brand new. It's more just like they're coming back and having different iterations or new lives. So anyway, but Stephanie Holmes and the domestic horror things I really like. Oh, I know another mashup that I think is great is this idea of the B heroes. So you definitely see it with the Slow Horses, the Nick Herron, where they're like the spies who were disgruntled or failed spies and things like that. Oh, we've had all these years of James Bond and these super competent people. And what if we have like the ones who are full of shame and the ones who are drunks and drug users or gamblers and stuff like that? So I think there's this, and then I think there's also some superhero movies that focus on the kind of less popular the less kind of heroic characters. So I think there's different mashups that are definitely out there and coming. Oh, and then the other one that I'm seeing a lot of now is like older characters, right? Everybody and their brother wants to have the octogenarian retirement home sleuths. There's the Richard Osman series that's turned into a big thing. And there's the Ted Danson series. And of course, Only Murderers in the Building. So those are taking like cozies and that idea. They're not like graphic mysteries, but you're still having a lot of elements, but just with an older crowd than we're used to seeing. I think really watching and thinking about it, watching stuff and thinking like, how did they put this together? And how would I have put it together? You guys probably have this, right? You watch a movie and you're just like, oh, it's so good. I love it. It's great. But I wish they'd done this. And I think we as storytellers do that instinctively, and it's helping us train our storytelling muscles when we do that. I think that would be this consuming story. But when you have a hard day, you just need to watch a movie or read a book. Absolutely. But it also helps to be like thinking about what you're doing at other times too.
Yeah, no, 100%. It feels like too, like my big takeaway from this is tropes are ultimately psychological shortcuts that are signaling to a viewer or reader, anyone experiencing a story. It's like a huge like signpost, as you'd say, right? Like in academic writing, like, hey, this is coming. Like there's tension here, there's conflict that's coming, and there's all these things that we innately grab onto because of the human experience. But I think you made the crucial point, like right up front, which is that we want the same thing but a little different. And when you're able to take, like you're mentioning, like that culture goes in cycles. Like, domestic horror, is it entirely brand new and novel, like they invented like an entirely new thing? It's like, yes, kind of no, because you've got the Shirley Jacksons, as you mentioned, but there's something interesting because you put it in the culture and context of now, characters that might be in slightly more familiar situations to people now, thinking of like setting tropes, object tropes. Oh, okay. Now we put a slight spin on something, and that slight spin is actually everything. And I think that's such a fascinating way of looking at it, because I think some writers can feel trapped by tropes. I've heard like conversations of, oh my God, all the viewers, all the readers want is just tropes. And it can feel like formulaic, right? I have to put XYZ in my book to get this type of sales. I have to put this in my film. And no, that's not what you're saying. What you're saying is that actually, first of all, use your instincts, right? And then second of all, fall back on if something's not working. There's these really important trope structures, but innovate, get creative, and try and do something that hasn't been done before, but that still hits these core structural trope points. I think that's so empowering, because it's like there's literally infinite combinations of these core tropes.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Yeah, I think of tropes are really just as, depending on how much you study writing, you think of them as archetypes, but actual, like everyday people don't think of that word. they are familiar with tropes. So just use tropes as a word when you're talking about it. It's okay. I feel like an improperly developed trope is where you get a cliche or you get something bored or people. But if you like push it further, one thing I wanted to mention is Severance. I don't know if you
Ooh,
guys have seen it. Oh,
Severance
yeah.
is great. Yeah.
I am like, ugh, I just love it so much. But one thing I wanted to mention is when I saw the trailers for it originally, I was like, oh, what is that? I want to know. And then I was like halfway through the first season when I was like, this is an application of the amnesia trope. Totally did not get that. And I'm like, oh my God, this is my job. But they did such a terrific job of it that I wish more people would watch it because of the way they use the amnesia trope, because it gets used a lot. And I've used it myself this way as like the bonk on the head and then they regain their memories later. The interesting thing about amnesia is that it's about power. It's about relationships and power. And if you see that, then you see all the different ways that show is actually about that and about taking somebody who chooses to separate those things. So I just think it's a great example of a trope that people are very quick to dismiss, but it has so much storytelling potential.
Especially when you combine it with the unique in that context, like place.
Oh yeah, all the other things.
The genius in that. And
the world.
and then even it goes into the marketing too, because you had Apple TV produced Severance. When the recent season they did a massive marketing blitz for it, and they had in Grand Central Station, it went super viral. They had the place and setting ingrained into it. In the middle of Central Station. And then they also decked out like Bell Labs, where it's filmed, is actual office space. So that's also fascinating. Like you could technically go work in Bell Labs right now. And Squid Games did this too. Their marketing, and also obviously the storytelling of Squid Games is just like when we talk about conflict, right? It's like such a clear motivation and conflict. Motivation is like to make money and get out of debt. Conflict is you die if you don't win.
Right,
Like,
absolutely. It's super simple, but yet tight.
Super tight. And it's, okay. And then now you can do all these different, like they had a VR game, like the number one VR game in the world is the Squid Games VR game, which VR is like a very interesting platform, but that's the number one. They had 10 billion views on social media on 30 in-person activations where they're able to like have the fans be part of different races, different competitions. They did different boats with the guards because the character trope there, like just wild stuff. And it's like, like Netflix too is like probably the best at marketing. I think like they're better than any traditional publisher. They're just like next level in terms of like how they market their shows. So it's really cool to study what they do. And Squid Games is like an absolute masterclass, especially for season 2. Season 3 is like kind of happening now. So like maybe in a couple of months we'll do analysis on it. But yeah, it's like, this is simple stuff, right? Like we're just taking a game show and putting it on steroids effectively. And to show you how like effective that is, like that, like still to this day, the most popular YouTube video Mr. Beast has ever produced is the Squid Games remake. And like his channel is all about essentially like game shows with stakes. And it's like, but Squid Games hit that hard.
Yes. And again, like Severance, Squid Games had such a great sense of visualness.
Oh,
so Nick mentioned like twisting something. I'm like the murderous little girl in the school where they the red light,
the young Z doll, and the music too.
Yes, and the music, and those jumpsuits, and so there were so many great things they did production wise that made it like that stairway that I love to watch them have to go up and down all the time in the series. And so there's a lot of really cool stuff. But even if you think of I didn't realize that doll had a name, but if you made that like a machine gun, a man with a machine gun with this really stern expression. Yeah, it would be scary, but it's worse if it's like a pigtailed little girl in a dress.
Totally, totally like subverts expectations. And also talk about power. You're now giving power to this imagery of a young girl rather than the man that we traditionally expect to have the power, or the masculine figure. And there's something like interesting too in terms of the music that they do, because the music is all about reinforcing the psychological tropes, like pink guards, like is like iconic. And now what's so amazing is like, regardless of whether you're watching this as a writer and you're like, okay, I want to like, go produce films and something like Creatorwood, or you're watching this going, I'm going to stick to my books. Now you can use things like Suno and literally make soundtracks in seconds. Like if you listen to the intro podcast song here on this podcast, we made it using Suno for $10, and you can make 30 or 40 songs on Suno, commercial rights, use it for whatever you want. So we live in a crazy age now where like you can take and rip the best marketing that Netflix is doing. And you don't need to spend millions of dollars. You can spend $10 and get your soundtrack that reinforces all these things. Because again, songs, and you mentioned this, songs are storytelling and have tropes in it, right? Every song you've got, country is just trope filled, all of country.
There's the character who played Laszlo in the What We Do in the Shadows, which is a great example of mashup.
Yeah.
He's a musician, right? That character. I can't think of that man's name. Anyway, my son was listening to some YouTube and I kept hearing this same music thing. And I'm like, what is that for? He's like, oh, it's just a music thing they play. It's a music thing he wrote for a show that got ripped off of that show and is just in YouTube now, but people like my age who recognize it then it like makes us go look it up and follow. So it's all really interesting of all the different ways to get people's attention.
Jennifer, this was incredible. And
It's super fun to talk to you guys.
yeah, you're amazing. And I have a feeling that folks are going to be like, how do I dive deep into tropes? And you are the creator of Trope Thesaurus that span many genres. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about your work and where we can find you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, the best way to find about my work is to visit my website at www.jenniferhilt.com. And my books are available on Amazon and Wide. And the books are they're not all this. I don't want people to think they're all the same. Like I talk about different genres because I talk about what the expectations are in those genres and I use different examples.
It's huge. It's so great. It's so needed. And yeah, I encourage everyone to do a deep dive into it. You'll probably walk away with 100 different story ideas by the time you get to the end of it.
That's my thing is that I hope people feel like excited and enabled and not like afraid.
You're taking a sort of simple yet can feel complex topic and making it ultimately fun.
Good.
Yeah.
That makes me happy.
Yeah, no, it's great. So yeah, those links will be down below as well. And Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me. Super fun.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. It was a ton of fun. What a cool thing. I get to talk to some of the coolest people on this show and then share it with y'all. And I'm very lucky. I'm very grateful for all of y'all. And if you have anyone cool you'd like me to talk to, anyone who you think you could learn from, who you think the industry needs to hear from, and even if that person's you, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to take guest breeze and guest recommendations. And with that said, thank you for listening. Definitely subscribe on YouTube if you haven't, or subscribe in one of the podcast feeds, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts. It really helps out. The more people who listen, the more sustainable it makes it for me to do this. So I'm just very grateful for you hopping along this journey, because it's just the early days. And as always, don't forget, together, we are boundless. I'll see y'all soon. Hey y'all, just as a quick little note, we had an issue in recording with some of the questions that were asked. They just didn't make it into the final version, so they were re-recorded later. So if you hear like an audio difference between some of the questions I asked and then Jennifer's responses, just know that they were recorded at different times, but don't worry, you have all the information and the full conversation in one place.